Vamos a arrancar entonces con esta segunda parte, la sesión 2, el valor de la industrialización. Quiero poner en contexto, vamos a retomar esta segunda dimensión de nuestro diálogo de los recursos al empleo, el valor de los minerales para América Latina. Bien sabemos, aquellas personas que estamos acá, que la industrialización, el desarrollo tecnológico, la competitividad de las cadenas de valor son elementos clave para fortalecer la posición de América Latina en esta economía que es globalizada y en este mundo y en esta economía global. Para introducir esta temática, voy a dejar en este espacio, voy a introducir a quien nos va a setear la conversación del siguiente panel, es nuestro Keynote Speaker. Vamos a invitar entonces al escenario, mientras esperamos ya que se acerquen, que puedan tomar asiento. Les prometemos más espacio para el café y el encuentro. Quiero dejar en este espacio a lonut, Johnny Lazar, consultor principal del CRU en Londres. Así que, bienvenido. Welcome to Chile. Fuerte el aplauso.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Many thanks to the World Bank for the invite and to Fundación Chile for the organization. I'm here to talk to you about the topic of industrialization and the need for industrialization. And I'll start, as every consultant does, by essentially copying a lot of what I heard that was very good from the previous speakers. I think we could have put the title of this presentation as ¿Dónde está la nuestra Hitachi? I think that would have been a much better title than what I put on the screen, so thank you, William, for that. It's a very good question because ultimately we live in very strange times. I joined CRU in 2007, 1 year after our Santiago office opened. And if you had said to me in 2007 that the price of copper would be $12,000 and that would result in somewhere between 2 and 3% economic growth, I would have said you need to drink less and learn to forecast better. So we live in strange times, and the answer is you do need more industrialization, and I think Director Tapa said it very well. You have to get from mining to manufacturing. The problem with that is that there is a middle step, and that's the midstream. Without the midstream, it's very difficult to take that step from mining to manufacturing. And so to get to the Hitachi, you do have to get through the Sumitomo. I think that's a lesson that you can learn anywhere in the world in industrial development. So what we're talking about here is the conclusions of a study that CRU did together with the World Bank. It will be published in the next few days, so it should be available to read, but essentially talks about the enabling factors for midstream development in the Southern Hemisphere and with a focus on Latin America. I'm not going to tell you anything new here. I think you've already heard today that the revolution in technology that we're going through at the moment requires a lot of the minerals that are abundant in South America. I think everyone knows this, and it's one of the topics that underpins industrial development going forward. So I won't talk about it too long. We're crossing that with a very strange geopolitical environment. I think I heard Secretary Santana talk about the fact that mineral industry is now a geopolitical industry, and that's very much true. You've heard several definitions this morning already about criticality in the minerals industry. And criticality makes it necessary for these minerals to be made available in a number of different forms. But it's very rare that criticality is limited to the mining form. And that's why the midstream is so important. Because the need for these minerals in strategic end uses, in the key end uses where concentration is the highest, is at refined level. And so this isn't just an opportunity to develop the midstream. It is a need to develop the midstream. And it is the need to develop this midstream in multiple geographies so that the global value chains that underpin some of the strategic industries that we talk about can continue to operate well. Otherwise, you are very heavily exposed to a number of very limited trade routes that are under a lot of strain at the moment. Again, if in 2007 someone had said to me, Johnny, In 2026, the price of sulfuric acid will be $650 a ton, and you won't be able to get any. Again, I would have said to learn to forecast better, and yet here we are. So if anyone doubts the importance of midstream, go and ask an electrowinning operation in copper whether they need sulfuric acid or not, and where they're going to get that from. It's always the midstream. A lot of the other definitions of criticality around better traceability of material, around better flow of the value chain, are also focused on refined minerals. Now, does that make them the responsibility of Latin America to solve the problems in the supply chain? No, it makes them everyone's problem. And so the perspective that I want to give you today is not limited to Latin America. It's very much a global problem that Latin America has an opportunity to participate in solving. There's already been a lot of bilateral cooperation. I heard something else a bit earlier today, and I thought it was very good. A perfect plan is not as useful as a good plan with good cooperation and good coordination. That's probably the best takeaway from this morning, and I think that's probably one of the key topics that we're talking about here. All of these collaboration attempts are very early stages of something that needs to get a lot bigger and a lot more multilateral. That leaves the question of who does the driving. And in the past, the biggest problem has been that the midstream requires high levels of complexity. The issues that the midstream has in terms of demonstrating economic viability are very complex, and there's a number of them. They're not limited to Latin America. These are problems that everyone has. But the traditional interpretation of these issues has always been focused on a couple of very important topics. Mainly, OPEX competitiveness, so cost competitiveness on the operating side, the cost of energy and the availability of that energy, and then the raw material supply. Now, we know the raw material supply is a problem at the moment. The mining industry is doing its best to supply this growing demand, but new supply is coming slowly. And that's a problem for the midstream sector because access to that feedstock is becoming more and more expensive. But that's not one of the key problems that stands in the way of midstream development. It's actually something that can be solved as long as that access to feedstock is predictable and transparent. It can be high cost. Many of the midstream operations that have been started, mainly in China over the last 20 years, but more recently in Indonesia as an example, have access to very expensive feedstock and quite expensive energy. But the access to that feedstock is predictable and the access to that energy is abundant. And so even though that operating cost is quite high, those assets are able to bring forward capacity and to demonstrate economic viability. Why is that? Because they solve the other two big questions here, and that's scale and competitiveness on the capital side. These are capital-intensive assets that require high levels of investment with a lot of uncertainty around them. Some of these industries that we talked about that are pushing electrification are very dynamic. Because they're very dynamic, they change the solutions all the time. Every early industry is like this. So the solutions change all the time, the level of uncertainty changes all the time. That always pushes up the capital intensity. But this is a problem that because of criticality right now, because of the strain on the value chains that we're seeing around the world right now, that's a problem that we can start to solve through multilateral cooperation. I think the World Bank is taking a really important role in trying to supply some of the coordination around this. And there is certainly a lot of appetite to provide investment. I think you heard about the example in Brazil on heavy rare earth mining and separation. That was very much a response to criticality. The existence of that criticality across these value chains provides opportunities to solve the capital problem. Once you solve the capital problem, a lot of the other problems become a lot easier to solve. The importance of solving those problems at scale is not just about retaining value. It is about retaining value, of course it is, and it's also about retaining employment and developing the industries and the economies of the countries that host the resource. That hasn't changed over the last 20 years. I could have done this presentation 20 years ago and it would have been very similar. But right now, value is being left on the table because that midstream sector that's so concentrated in a few places, again, mainly China, is where byproduct credits are being collected. It's where different specifications of feedstock can be blended and valorized properly. It's where industries that are highly volatile, like sulfuric acid, can all of a sudden show outsized levels of profitability. But all of that happens because the asset was built in the first place, and it was built with the requisite scale to compete on the world market and to supply the world market. I think, again, I cannot emphasize enough, OPEX inflation has been a problem alongside the gradual degradation of head grades in most of the extractive industries. But actually, capital inflation has been much, much, much more of a problem. Right now, ask any miners in the room today, it costs 2 or 3 times what it used to cost to build the same copper mine. Well, the same problem happens in the midstream. The difference being midstream has a lot more of an uncertainty associated to it. The cost of raw materials isn't clear. The availability of end-use markets isn't clear. And so those uncertainties push that capital risk, the risk and the capital premium up for these industries. But this is a problem that can be solved. It can be isolated and it can be solved. To solve it, it requires a little bit of courage, because early forays into a refining industry are always at the top end of the cost curve. That's why I was saying, as long as there is access, visible, transparent, predictable access to feedstock and abundant supply of energy, everything else can be solved. When you start at the top end of the refining cost curve on an OPEX basis. To get to the lower end of the OPEX cost curve, you have to start somewhere. To optimize, you have to start higher up on the cost curve. The recent experiences in Argentina and their very promising starts show us that when you do that, investment can flow in. When investment flows in from multiple sources, you have competitiveness in the way that that investment is deployed. And when that happens, the capital cost comes down. Once you make those starts and once you have the bravery to identify those starts, the Chinese example has taught us that you can optimize pathways and you can get lower down on the cost curve. The graph on the right here shows the aluminium industry in 2000 and the presence of a few Chinese assets towards the top end of that cost curve. Where are Chinese assets now on the cost curve? Everywhere. But to do that, you have to start somewhere. The alternative is that you remain heavily dependent on a single trade route that is now under increasing stress. I think that's why it's very important to emphasize the collaboration efforts spearheaded by the World Bank, but multi-stakeholder at the moment, to try and solve this capital intensity problem and to bring some of these investments to fruit. Because that enables the creation of auxiliary industries in a very similar way to what the mining industry has done. It enables innovation and it enables that transition from the mining to the manufacturing. I'm going to close there, but leave you with these thoughts, and I hope the panel will continue that discussion. Essentially, there isn't a silver bullet that's going to solve the problem of how challenging it is to be cost competitive in the midstream. The problems are not unique to Latin America, and the solutions aren't going to be unique to Latin America either. But the geostrategic context that we find ourselves in and the strain of those trade routes that we've come to rely on so heavily mean that there are questions about whether we should continue to rely on that single source of refined material. And I think to hide from those questions is to essentially hide from reality at the moment. I think scale is very, very important. I think in the macroeconomic world, we're very used to operating with percentages. And if you hear the words 10% of the global market, you say, okay, we have an important part to play. But when you realize that global market for copper, for example, has moved from 10 million tons to 50 million tons, the size of that problem becomes a lot more apparent. So scale remains important. I think it's been very clear, and we've seen this with the squeeze in the value chains for rare earths, that some of these geostrategic issues are starting to become painful enough for people to do something about them. But that issue is spilling into core industries like copper, like zinc, and soon into the battery industry as well. So that means there's a lot more public and private appetite for investments that are going to solve that problem, more so than I've personally seen in 20 years of doing this. So the message is very much, look, we don't ignore the cost competitiveness challenges, but they can be part of the list of challenges that we take on. The key thing is to solve the problem of scale and the problem of capital intensity and risk. I think this energy transition is not going to be there forever. It's going to have its various stages of macroeconomic deployment, and you can either be part of those stages or you can watch them pass by. But this is a time of opportunity, not necessarily to become a large proportion of that midstream supply, but to provide enough midstream supply to resolve some of the geostrategic questions that are becoming pretty important going forward. It's part of my job description to also tell you that we can be part of the problem, because obviously when a problem becomes too complex, you have to ask the consultants what to do. So we're at your disposal to grapple with some of these questions and to provide some of the logic behind some of these investments. Our office in Santiago is very well staffed and looks forward to seeing as many of you as possible, and look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you.